Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband News, a special edition of Broadband News. My guest today is Lori Adams from Nokia, and we'll be talking all things BEAD. Be right back. Hey everyone, welcome. As I mentioned, my special guest today is Lori Adams. Lori's a VP of Broadband Policy and Funding Strategy for Nokia. She's a telecom attorney. She's got extensive experience in federal, state, and local telecom issues, legal, regulatory matters, grant funding, public policy. So excellent guest today to be talking about BEAD. Hello, Lori.
Hey, Rick, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Very good. Thank you. And Lori has an anthropology degree. That's how she started. So I would like to find out a little bit about folks about how they transition from what they went to school for and what they eventually wind up doing. Tell me a little bit about that. How'd you get from one to the other?
Yeah, it was a sort of a circuitous route, but when I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist and Indiana Jones.
Yep.
And
Oh yeah, fedora. Yeah.
oh yeah, and when I got to college, I ended up taking some anthropology classes and loved it, and so ended up majoring in that and did a archaeology dig in college. At Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. And I thought it was great. The only thing that prevented me from going forward into a career in archaeology was that the good archaeology jobs are hard to find. And, I wanted to be a little bit more in control of my life, where I lived, what I did, and wanted to make a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like as a career choice, it might not be the right thing, but it was great for being in college. And I ended up taking a couple years to work before going to law school, and then ended up in telecom not that long after I graduated from law school, but have spent most of my career with one foot in politics and all things kind of legislative policy side of things, and the other foot in telecom. So.
Well, it all sounds interesting. I think it would be interesting being an archaeologist, and it's interesting. Telecom has certainly been interesting, especially the last several years. So,
yeah, it's kind of funny when you think about it that I sort of wanted to, was looking at being somebody who pulled things out of the ground, and now I'm putting things in the ground. So,
yeah, there you go. Yeah. So let's talk about BEAD. So, I wanted to first ask, kind of thinking of where we are today. But looking back, it's been 3 years approximately since the Infrastructure Act passed, about 2.5 years or so from the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So what's your biggest surprise, kind of seeing where we are today, and then looking back then as far as where we are today with BEAD?
I'm not sure anything is surprising, and let me explain why. Because when I first read. I read the act, the relevant portions of the infrastructure bill when it came out. And of course, I read the part about BEAD. And then I thought to myself, wow, this seems like it's going to be a complicated program. And when NTIA released their notice of funding opportunity, I read it. And the first thing I did was I wrote down on the front cover of my copy, WTF. I thought this was the most complicated, convoluted, complex program that I had ever seen. And, I was intimately involved in the prior NTIA program, the very first one, the BTOP program that was results of the American, Reinvestment and Recovery Act in 2009. And the BEAD NOFO was just so complex. So I am not surprised that here we are, 3 years after the program was created in the infrastructure bill, that we have not yet seen any money distributed to subrecipients. We are on the eve of that happening, however, in multiple states. And so we are about to see, we've kind of, we're at the precipice of this changing from a program that's focused on policy and planning and initiatives to implementation. So we're about to see that. That being said, the program is about 6 to 9 months delayed from where they should be if everything were working smoothly. That being said, it's still moving, and like I said, we're about to see things happen fast.
Yeah, it's starting to come together. And I forgot to mention, so for those of you watching, we are here and can take questions. So if you have any questions as we're talking, just feel free to type those into YouTube chat, and I will see those pop up here, and I can ask Lori about those. So another question I have is kind of based around what you were just saying, with looking at the notice of funding opportunity and how much there is in there. What have been the biggest challenges for, let's say, the states, for example, as they try to ingest all of that and figure out how they're going to do everything?
Yeah, I mean, first the states had to set up broadband offices, and there were a bunch of states that were had been giving out state-funded broadband grants for years, and so they had a leg up on the infrastructure that they needed to support the BEAD program. But there were quite a few states that were hiring their first broadband director for the first time to implement BEAD.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges early on that the states were facing was that they weren't just having to process and implement the BEAD program, but they were also responsible for the digital equity program that NTIA was, administering as well. And so those two programs in tandem were a lot of work. And it was a lot of technical expertise that was required, a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that had to be assembled. I actually think the implementation phase of this is going to be easier for states in some ways than what's happened over the last 2.5 years, because trying to put those offices together, put those plans together, figure out how they were going to do stuff, right? I think seeing those things in motion may be actually a little bit easier than what they've done so far. But that being said, there's significant challenges that lay ahead for the states.
Yeah, and then I think similar, what kind of challenges for maybe some of the service providers? Because again, there was a lot in that notice of funding opportunity. I've said in the past, there's a lot of stuff in there I thought that was not really relevant to broadband, that maybe could have not been in there, that maybe has been the cause of some of the delays. So what do you think about some of the stuff that's in there, and how is that impacting the service providers?
Some of the early criticism was around some of the policies, right? Like you had to take into account there's some climate requirements, environmental requirements, there's labor and wage requirements, there's a whole lot of stuff. Cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. Now, those are things that I think should have been in there. That obviously cybersecurity is critically important and supply chain is also critically important. So, it's a lot to manage if you're a CSP looking at this. One of the earlier barriers to the program that NTIA sort of loosened the restriction on a little bit was the letter of credit. And, sort of those gateway barriers to participating in BEAD were what we heard early on was a big problem for a lot of the CSPs. You kind of had two camps early on. The people that were saying, okay, this program's not what we envisioned, what we wanted entirely. There's things in it we don't like, but we're all in. And then there's folks that have been saying, yeah, we're on the fence. We don't know what to do about it. And I literally this morning had calls with two of those companies that were on the fence, looking at BEAD. They've decided to jump in, and now they're really, working to pull everything together as fast as they can. And we've been talking with customers and CSPs for months, saying, hey guys, don't get caught up in the process issues. If you're thinking, even remotely thinking about participating in BEAD, start working on pulling things together that you're going to need. Because once those grant windows open, you're not going to have time to act. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yep.
Louisiana opened their grant window and only allowed 2 weeks to accept applications.
Yep.
They were the extreme. Most states are somewhere between 30 and 60 days for that grant window, but it's not a lot of time. And if you wait until that window opens, you're going to be out of time.
Yep. Do you feel like the Build America, Buy America is pretty well settled now? I know you guys are, you're good on that. In fact, I think I saw the live thing that was done. I think it was Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I think you've got one or two other locations. So you
Yes.
probably feel good about that. Do you think everybody are going to be able to get what they need as far as all the materials? Yeah.
I do. I will say this, BABA is a settled question. This was something that was a huge barrier initially. We were very concerned as an industry how this was going to play out, because particularly for broadband electronics that are supported by a global supply chain, it has taken decades for these supply chains to materialize and be fine-tuned, and they are global. Where you get components from, where you manufacture products. And the Buy America provisions are very strict. The law that was part of the infrastructure bill is very strict. And Nokia, we spent thousands of hours internally looking at our components, our supply chain, our products, our manufacturing processes, educating NTIA on all of those things, because we knew that they were going to require some products to be manufactured in the US, and we wanted to be part of the solution rather than be a company that was waiting to react to how the waiver turned out. We wanted to participate in these conversations and dialogues up front. As a result of our work, we had an announcement with the Vice President and the Secretary of Commerce in Kenosha, where we announced the U.S. manufacturing, and we were the first electronics vendor to do that. Earlier this year in April, I was back out in Kenosha with Alan Davidson, is the assistant administrator for NTIA, who was holding one of the first line cards that was rolling off the production line in Kenosha. So we are manufacturing products as we speak. I like to say there is no such thing as a BABA store, however, right? We don't have a large inventory as an industry of BABA products, not at scale, and certainly nothing that supports the magnitude of a $42.5 billion infrastructure program. So our recommendation to customers is BABA is in fact settled. Any product that is required to be made in the US, the earlier you get those orders in, the better. Understand that, getting a foot in the door of the supply chain will help you execute your project. And all of these BEAD timelines are on a 4-year time frame. And so do not wait to get your order in. We are talking with customers about pre-orders. We will work with customers who are looking at applying for BEAD to give them a quote. You also have to have a manufacturer certification letter, which comes directly from the manufacturer to certify that the products you're selling into BEAD meet the standard for BABA. Right. So make sure you know all the little rules here, but it's really not that hard. But make sure you're informed and get those manufacturer certification letters.
Yeah, and I guess the manufacturers self-certify, right? So they self-certify, but then they have to provide that to the operators. Correct.
Yeah, NTIA essentially put out a form, and it was a very simple form. It was essentially like your company name, what's your website, do you certify these products meet the requirements, and then it's signed by a company officer.
And it says under penalty of law.
Under penalty of law, under all these penalties, right?
Don't tell
America jail. Yeah. And then you send in the letter, the certification, and it points back to your website. So NTIA has a list that's about a page and with a couple lines onto a second page of manufacturers who have sent those in. You can pull it up. You can link to the website. Use those product websites to build your bill of materials for Buy America. Don't build a budget for BEAD and then determine that your half of those products aren't BABA compliant. Make sure you're looking at these BOMs and use those to build your materials list for BEAD.
Yeah, interesting. So, and the other big challenge, so you've got the materials, the other big challenge is workforce, because again, you've got this $42.5 billion program, and then you're going to have all of these people that are doing that. You've got installers, I guess, deploying the fiber. So what are your feelings about that? How significant is that challenge going to be?
It is being underestimated, by the way. This is something that we have, as an industry, have been talking about for, since the creation of the BEAD program, the labor force required to execute. In August, I moderated a keynote panel for Mountain Connect with Evan Feynman, who's the state program director for NTIA. And I asked Evan, I said, "Are you guys concerned about having enough resources, labor, capacity for 50 states and 6 territories to simultaneously build these projects?" And he said, "No, it doesn't keep me awake at night at all." And I was like, "Well, it keeps me awake at night, and I'm not even administering this program." The amount of effort that it is going to be required to build these networks is sorely underestimated. And a lot of these states are also talking about, they're planning what's called non-deployment funds, essentially leftover money. So these are states that think, based on preset models that they've gotten from a variety of sources, that they're going to have enough money to connect everybody, mostly with fiber, and then have money left over to do non-deployment things like digital equity and other programs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first 10 states that launch BEAD may be in a position where they have non-deployment funds. The more you get into this, the more you have states launching construction, the more resources that are demanded, the higher the labor rates are going to go up. The higher the costs are going to be, the harder it's going to be to find workers, and the harder it's going to be to keep workers on your job. I mean, anyone who's built a broadband network has had horror stories about contractors working with subcontractors who just walk off. They walk off the job because they have another offer someplace else at a higher wage, or there's better conditions, or there's some reason. That is going to happen for BEAD. You will see that happening for BEAD. It is going to be difficult to find the workers needed to deploy these projects. And states are engaged in this, but states are always also looking at this in a vacuum. They are not really considering what is happening around them per se. They're very focused on their program. And I've heard some state directors say, "Oh yeah, we're not the first for BEAD. We're not going to be in the first group. We're slow rolling things. We're really, we want to do this right." And I'm like, if you're in the back end of things, you are going to find it exponentially harder and more expensive to build. So the workforce problem is going to be real.
That's interesting, because I was thinking maybe one of the good things about the fact that it's 50 different states and territories, that would help in a sense that you're not trying to do this all at once. You're going to have maybe Louisiana out there first and a few others, and then they're going to be kind of coming out at different times. But you think the later you are, probably the worse off you are.
Let me put it this way. So if you think about the time, I mean, Louisiana had their volume 2 proposal approved in December of last year. So they're coming up on their deadline for getting their whole process, their program completed, so they can submit their final proposal.
Yep.
The next state that got approval was in April of this year. So between April of this year and the end of October, every state except for Texas and Louisiana had their volume 2s approved.
Right.
All of those states are going to be in the same time frame, right? The earlier states will have an advantage. Anyone in the back 25 to 30 states is going to struggle.
That's interesting. So I wanted to look at a couple of questions here, and one is a question that I had. William Loudon says, thoughts on Trump and potential to direct funds to Starlink. But let's talk about the election first. So we do have an election in less than a week now. Is that right? Yeah, less than a week.
You do? I wasn't sure.
If you hadn't heard, there's an election next week. So what are your thoughts on, and it's really close, really, really close. So we might not even know who the president is for several days, or hopefully it'll be within a few days. So what are your thoughts on how BEAD might change, let's say, if Trump wins? And then also, if Harris wins, do you think there'll be any changes? I think obviously Trump is the biggest change, but
yes.
What are your thoughts there?
So I get asked this question, I think, every day. And two things. One is that there will be a change in the administration, period, right? Mm-hmm. So you will have someone new in the office of president, meaning they will be putting in new cabinet folks,
FCC.
new FCC, new people all over the place, right? It's going to rely on the nomination system to process, the political positions. That won't change the civil servants, the people that are, currently in positions that work in agencies that come to work every day, regardless of who the president is and the change in administration. So there's some continuity that will be there from, just the top levels will change, but the bottom and middle levels will stay the same. As a legal matter, BEAD is a pretty secure program because it was appropriated through Congress. It was signed into law. It was enacted by the president. It was signed by him. So it is it's off to the side. It's been enacted. The money's there. The programs are underway. The states have the money. It's in process. So I think there's little threat that you would see Congress claw this program back or kill it, right?
It is a very
it is a very popular program with the states, with governors,
with Republicans.
With Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in Indiana this summer and heard a presentation by the chairman of the finance committee who said, look, we have been investing in broadband as a state. We are holding off additional monies allocated for broadband because we want to see how far BEAD will go. Mm-hmm. So, they are invested in making sure that BEAD is a success. So I don't expect much change with a Harris administration, business as usual. Maybe some things will start to move faster. With a Trump administration, the more likely scenario is that they begin to waive some of those requirements that are considered to be the more, problematic. Mm-hmm. Some of the labor and wage requirements, some of the climate stuff, some of the other policy aspects that weren't part of the original act, but that NTIA included as in the NOFO. There's also a risk of potential slowdown of the program because you need people at NTIA level to process approvals for things to become final. And so, that is at risk of potentially delays. But, ultimately, I think people really want this program to go faster. We are on the verge of 2 states issuing out provisional awards. Louisiana could come out at any moment. They need to submit their full proposal, final plan to NTIA December 30th or 15th, and they have a 30-day period where they have to publish the list of winners for public comment. So we're going to start to see sub-awards handed out very quickly. And, I think the train has really come too far. It's about to speed up. But the most likely scenario is that if Trump is in there, that the administration moves things, waives some of the more problematic provisions.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. So William's question about Trump says, thoughts on Trump and potential to direct funds to Starlink. So I guess that question, as well as your thoughts on Starlink for those really, really, really hard to reach areas.
So it's an interesting question because the FCC disqualified Starlink from receiving RDOF funds, right? On the basis of speed, that they did not have the ability to, the speed and latency requirements were not sufficient. Now, NTIA just released some proposed guidance recently on alternate technologies, which were always considered to be valid in the last resort scenario. For states, right? So the states have to reach every location that's unserved and underserved on their map. There will be some, maybe between 2% to 10% of the locations that are unreachable by other technologies that will be viable for Starlink.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, you talk to the states, they are fiber first. The states believe that. They want fiber to go as deeply as they can get it. But there will be some areas where it will only be served by Starlink.
Yeah, and I think where William is going also is, of course, Trump and Elon Musk are kind of allies there. So, and I think I did hear a comment. This has become a very political issue because, again, we're 3 years out. it's right before the election, and everybody can, the Republicans, Trump can say that, no money has been put to use to bring broadband. So they've got a valid point on that. They might have been able to do it sooner without maybe some of those other extraneous things in there, but it's a political issue at this point. And I did hear somebody say that we could have taken that money and given everybody Starlink, but then again, then you have satellite, right? So I think the NTI is doing a good job of really trying to focus on fiber as much as they can, but say, we're realistic and we can't do fiber everywhere. So we need.
Listen, fiber is the enabling technology, right? Yeah. There is nothing better than fiber. Right. Fiber enables wireless. It enables everything. It is a catalyst. It is, if you look at what folks are doing globally, Europeans, most of our friendly, our European Union colleagues and friends, and they all have fiber to the home. It is a standard. It is a global gold standard. Mm-hmm. We have a project we're working on with the National Broadband Initiative in Ireland, NBI. Mm-hmm. They're connecting every single household with fiber, regardless of where it's located, even on the islands. Mm-hmm. NBI is a extremely successful program. It can be done, right? The question of whether it should be done in some of those hardest to reach, most expensive areas is really the economics, the question there. But there's no doubt. Fiber is a catalyst. We need it for growth. It supports the electronics and the technology and the things that are where innovation is happening. Mm-hmm. But the fiber you put in the ground, it's there for the next 30, 40, 80 years. So it is not, it is a strong and valid investment and really the place where the federal government should be investing in technology. And one thing that's interesting is that I was listening to a panel maybe about a year and a half ago with some private equity investors and the question was, are you investing in fixed wireless? Are you investing in non-fiber technologies? And they said, well, we consider it to be a risk because with the BEAD program, with Capital Projects Fund, with RDOF, with some of these programs, the federal government has put their finger down and said, fiber is our technology of choice. So that is a tipping point for investment, for growth. And so, ultimately, the states want fiber. They want to be able to serve their constituents and set their communities up for economic development and growth over the decades. And the only way to do that is with fiber. But there is room for wireless technologies and a role for Starlink in those hardest to reach places.
Yep. And, the NTIA does have that extremely high cost threshold per location in there. And that's specifically for that, right? To say each state has to set that. They've got to figure out where there is. Any thoughts on how the states are doing that? I think a lot of them are going to be looking at that after they get data back on who wants to bid. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And which is, I think is, initially I've sort of changed my thinking on this a little bit. I thought, well, how the heck are they going to, are applicants going to know what to shoot for if a state doesn't publish what that extremely high cost threshold is? Mm-hmm. But, that's kind of like showing your hand if you're a state, because you have folks that will undercut that bid and underbid anybody. Mm-hmm. This way they're getting true competitive bids. They will let the market set the threshold for what's right for them in that state. Based on their application submissions, they'll set that threshold and then consider what is too expensive for fiber. So I think it's a really smart way to do it. It'll be, I'm curious to see how that is played out with these states that are finishing up their grant processes now.
Yeah. So really, I guess what that's doing is it's showing them that if they don't get bids in certain areas, they know, okay, that's really a difficult high cost place, right? Because nobody wants to touch it.
Yeah. And, and I was talking to the Missouri office and they said that, initially they asked providers to kind of submit project areas that they wanted to see. So they were looking for project groupings that were friendly to territories and network footprints of companies that exist in Missouri. And, it's kind of a little bit of a free for all. Everybody draw what you want, send it in. And and they said, well, we learned a lot of lessons from that. But one of the things we learned was that there wasn't a location that wasn't part of a grouping. So there are, they got way more submissions than they anticipated. So, that shows you that the interest is there, the demand is there, the need is there. And, I think ultimately, like even Louisiana, I think they got the bulk of their locations were bid on in the first round. So, the interest is there. It's just a question of execution, and, getting those applications from concept to submission.
Yeah. So I have a question here from William Lee, and I had a question. I think it's similar, which is kind of what the timeline is, the next what's next for states, when states will start dispersing funds, when they'll start to be deployed. And William asks, can you please talk to us through how state broadband offices review, approve applications, and NTIA's approval process, which is part of that. So
yeah,
where are we now today, and how long do you think this stuff's going to play out, and how are the NTIA and the states and those reviews going to take place?
Most states have evaluation committees that will be tasked with reviewing the applications. Some are doing it in-house, 100% in-house. Others are outsourcing it to consultants that they've hired specifically to manage this part of the process for them. Every state has released a scoring rubric, which applicants have to consider when putting their application together, because essentially if the state has 2 applications for one project area, the higher scored application will win, right? That's how it's supposed to work. So these scoring rubrics are very, very critically important. And I'm amazed by the number of folks I've talked to who have not looked at the scoring rubric for their state. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This is what your applications will be judged on. And every effort should be made, if you're putting in an application, to achieve the highest amount of points you can based on your state's scoring rubric. So that is what is the basis for all of that. So the process is as follows. The grant window will open. Some states are only doing 1 round. Some are doing 2 or 3. Grant window will open. You'll submit the application. Grant window will close. They'll assess the scores. They'll come up with a provisional list of awardees. They'll try to put the puzzle together so that every location in a state is served by somebody. And that's the puzzle. Once they have the puzzle complete, most states are going to publish the list of awardees for public comment, for review. Then they will submit everything, basically all of the awardees and then the processes they followed, to NTIA for final proposal approval. Once NTIA approves a state's final proposal, then those awards become live and final, and a state can enter into a subgrant agreement with the customer. So from a timeline perspective, states can influence this by how fast they open and close grant windows, by how fast they review, by how fast they put that puzzle together. They have a maximum of 365 days to get that final proposal in, but some states are moving much faster than that.
Yeah.
So like Nevada, for example, they had their their volume 2 approval in the spring of this year. They are going to be they intend on submitting their final proposal by December. So they're moving a lot faster than what their timeline is. So it really depends on the state, but the process will be similar. The grant window opens, the evaluation, the publishing of the provisional awards, and then the waiting on approval by NTIA, which we're hopefully expecting within a couple of months of submitting that final proposal. NTIA has said they will move faster on the final proposals than they did on the volume 2s, but we will see how fast they move.
Yeah. And you were mentioning that scoring rubric. Where would somebody find that? Isn't that in volume 2 of the
volume
proposal?
2?
Okay.
Yeah. Every state has published their NTIA approved volume 2 initial proposal. That is where you find the scoring rubric.
Got it. Okay. And I think I somewhere have a link to that. So if anybody's watching after the stream at some point, I'll go ahead and put a link to where you can find those proposals for each state. But yeah. So timeline wise, so who do you think will be first? Will it be Louisiana?
Yep. Oh yeah, Louisiana is imminent. Yeah,
Yeah.
they are. Yeah, and then Nevada. There's a number of other states that have closed their grant window. Colorado, Montana, West Virginia. They are also in that grouping of early states. And now, and we're looking at in November, there's a whole bunch of states that are going to be opening up their grant windows. Georgia published their proposed set of questions yesterday for the application, or this week for the application process. Missouri's going to open their grant window, Pennsylvania, there's a whole bunch of states. So if things are going to happen very, very fast.
So when do you think the first service provider, subgrantee, will start building the network? Is that going to be early, like spring of next year?
Okay, so that's a trickier question, because let's take Louisiana for the example, right? So they submit their final proposal in December. Let's say that by March 1st, NTIA approves that proposal, the awards can be final. Louisiana will execute those subgrant agreements with their awardees, which they'll be negotiating. By the way, once they post those, once they start working through those provisional awards and it's posted and they send in that, they're going to be doing that while NTIA is looking at the final proposal. Most states will be doing that. So let's say a subgrantee agreement is executed on March 1st. This is the most aggressive timeline you could come up with.
Right.
They have to do an environmental review of their project area. That could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months.
And could that change with Trump coming in? Is that one of the things that you think could change?
Well, I mean, possibly. This is baked into federal law. It's part of the, it was part of the BTOP program. It's part of any federal grant, basically, to do one of these assessments. So now some of the rules for BEAD are a little bit different, but it's, that will take 3 to 6 months, give or take. Then, you've got to do your engineering. And some of these things stack on top of each other, right? There's stuff you can do while that environmental assessment's happening. Some things you can't do, like construction, until it's done. So let's say March 1st is when your subgrant executes. September 1st is when you complete your environmental assessment. Then you could potentially start construction probably in the fourth quarter of next year. So there will be some construction that happens next year in those early actor states, but the bulk of the construction will kick in 26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's the best case scenario you're saying, is it could be late next year. So how do you think? So I think all the states have been through their challenge process now, right?
Most have. I think a couple are finishing it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think the states feel pretty good about really knowing where their unserved and underserved locations are now, based on the FCC data they had and all of the challenge process?
Yes and no, right? Like, this is, everyone knows that any map you generate is going to be out of date the moment it's published. There will be locations missed by BEAD. That is a certainty. Some of it is because it just locations got missed. Others were that are part of other funding programs that default. RDOF being the biggest example. You talk to the states, the biggest question they have is RDOF, because every state has locations that they think will default for RDOF. And if that happens after the puzzle gets put together for BEAD, those locations are going to be missed. They were obligated as part of RDOF. They were ineligible for BEAD, later defaulted. Those will become unserved areas. So that is the biggest question. The maps are the best that folks can get with the information they have at their disposal under the rules of the program, but there will be locations missed.
Yeah, I think so too. So there's a question here from someone says, and I did see the story as well, your CEO's recent comments seem to reflect more excitement about data center opportunities than telecom. Curious if BEAD is ready to launch. I think what he's saying is that possibly because it is going to maybe be 2026, so there needs to be something to kind of fill the gap.
I mean, understand this, that BEAD is actually a small percentage of the investment being made in broadband infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You look at what is happening in the private equity space, right? Cities are largely left out of BEAD. The locations eligible for BEAD are the most rural. So you look at what's happening in the cities, you look at what's happening for innovation and data centers. We know we have a need for data centers in this country.
Mm-hmm. Especially with AI now. Yeah.
Especially all of that is happening in the backdrop, right? BEAD is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but it's a really there's a lot of investment. In fact, there was a report that came out this week talking about how last year was like $97 billion of infrastructure that was invested in by some of the top carriers. That was excluding some of the rural electric cooperatives and the telcos and those folks, just the biggest companies. That is overtaking the amount of investment that BEAD will bring. So, if you look at all of that together, there's just a massive amount of infrastructure investment happening. So, BEAD is just a piece, but, Nokia, we're a global technology company. We're focused on all of it, right? Not just the public funding parts.
Yeah. Do you think that based on, some of the challenges for ISPs and the rules and just in general, that a lot of this, you mentioned, there's electric co-ops, there's municipalities, and there's the big cable MSOs and the big fiber providers, and then you've got the small independent cable operators and independent telephone companies. Do you think it's going to be mostly the big ISPs that are already in the business, maybe not so much municipalities, even though they would prefer to have the not-for-profits, the munis and the electric co-ops do this stuff? But what do you think? What are your feelings about who's going to be doing this?
Oh, it's going to be a mix. I've said from the get-go that I think overall it's going to end up being a 50-50 mix of the biggest carriers and cable and the smaller co-ops and munis and telcos. And I think that's still the case. Now, there will be some states where it will shift dramatically one way or the other. Mm-hmm. Some states will end up giving a lot of their money to the bigger guys, and then vice versa. Then the opposite will happen. You'll have states that will give most of the money to the smaller carriers. Mm-hmm. Looking at who, the biggest indicator of who's going to win BEAD is who has applied for grants and been successful in the past, who is building within a state. Those are the likely suspects. The other thing is that it's a lot. It is a lot to put together a BEAD application. If you are applying in multiple states, you have to know multiple programs, multiple sets of rules, submit multiple applications within one state, let alone across 10 or more. So it's going to be a strain for even the bigger carriers to do this, to execute, wholesale across the board. Let me apply in all of the states. I mean, obviously, the bigger carriers have resources to do that. But overall, there's going to be a mix. And that's evidenced by the list of qualified vendors that Louisiana published. If you look at that list, it contains everybody. There's some smaller, folks, regional small folks. There's the biggest carriers, and then there's some private equity money and some consortiums that were put together. So there's really a pretty broad mix of entities that applied in Louisiana.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what Nokia can do. How are you able to help? I don't know if you're working with state. Well, you already mentioned actually you were helping NTIA. You were actually helping at that level. But states, and then also for service providers, whether they be the smaller ones that are a little bit hesitant, a little bit shy about getting into this. What are you guys able to do? What have you put together?
So we are engaged at all levels, right? We are engaged, obviously, on an ongoing basis with the federal agencies. We are engaged directly with state broadband offices, providing resources and information. We are engaged with customers, and how we can help is this. As I mentioned before, everybody's going to need to have a Buy America certification letter for their BABA products. We can help you with that. We can, certainly provide you with that certification letter and help you create a bill of materials and a cost that's accurate for your budget. You don't want to put in placeholders and then find out later that your costs were all wrong. You only get one shot at the funding apple. You want to make sure that your budget is accurate. We can help with that. We have partners that we work with that can provide support on everything from writing your grant application all the way through to operations and BSS OSS. So, and we work closely with distributors. And those distributors can provide you with electronics, with materials, with fiber, with cable, with other things that can help mitigate your risk and enable you to tap into those resources that otherwise you would need to be a bigger carrier to achieve economies of scale. So there's a lot of places where Nokia can play, and we have a large ecosystem of partners that we're working with on this, and we'd be happy to help. Give us a call.
Good. Yeah. And actually, we're one of those partners. So
exactly.
Yeah. In fact, we're an expert partner with Nokia. So check us out at ZCorum.com and a few other things that we kind of come in on the back end. So there's good synergy between our companies. So a lot of what we do is once the network's built, all of those things that you need to do, whether that's billing your customers, providing end user technical support. We do help desk. We do cybersecurity as a service, which you mentioned is very important to have the NIST compliant cybersecurity in place. If you're going to do BEAD, we help with that. If you want to provide voice or IPTV over that network to your customers, so all kinds of things that we can do. You're working in conjunction with Nokia to really make it a full broadband offering, because you got to build a network, but then you got all the other stuff on top of that. And also, by the way, we announced at SCTE with Nokia that we have kind of a unique solution for the Altiplano platform, where you've got operators that maybe are too small to implement that. They don't have the technical expertise or the space, the resources to do that. We can host that Altiplano solution so that they can activate their Nokia fiber devices. We also actually we announced that earlier with Nokia, but we announced at SCTE a DOCSIS provisioning adapter. So there may be cable operators out there that you want to be able to deploy fiber in select areas, especially if you're going to be stepping into BEAD, and maybe you're doing HFC in other places, but you're going to be doing fiber, let's say, in a new area with BEAD, and you don't want to jump right into a brand new fiber provisioning system. You can use your DOCSIS provisioning system. And we've got a DOCSIS provisioning adapter that's some middleware that will translate between your DOCSIS provisioning system and Altiplano to be able to activate those Nokia devices. So you can step into that without having to completely replace your provisioning system. Because I think cable operators, they know fiber is the future as well. I mean, but they also have a big investment in their DOCSIS infrastructure. But if they go somewhere new, they're going to be certainly doing fiber. So we can help with that as well. Yeah. So let me see if I have any other questions here. There's some comments, no other questions that I see here. So any last thoughts on BEAD and what we can see? I guess a lot of it may be dependent on next Tuesday as to what happens there. But what are your thoughts? Anything else?
I just would urge anyone who's still undecided on BEAD to make that decision yesterday, right? You've got to make a decision. You need to look at the volume twos, look at what's happening in your state, because when those grant windows open, you won't have time to pull that application together. So, and we're talking with companies who are just now, in that mindset. And so I urge you to do that.
Yep.
But no, it's we can help. It's exciting time, and but it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a whole village to do this. So
yes, yeah,
it's a big village,
big endeavor. I think everybody knew it was this huge thing, and here we are. As you said, it was almost like hurry up and wait, but we're getting at that point now where things are going to start to happen. Not the building apparently till mostly 2026, but certainly lots of stuff's going to be happening here soon. So
yeah.
And if you are watching now and it's not live, and you really want to ask a question, go ahead and in YouTube, just put a comment in there and I will get that. And if I can't answer it, I'll get it over to Lori. She'll answer it for me, and then I'll place it up there. I'll reply to your comment on YouTube. So I appreciate everybody who watched today, everybody who is interacting on chat. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Lori, for your time. This was very informative, and hopefully I think it was for everybody else. And it's going to be exciting. So
Excellent. Thanks, Rick. It was great conversation.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, everybody. And I will see you next time for Broadband News. Have a great day. Bye-bye.